Hello friends, my name is Steve and this is Steve Talks About Books and Stuff. It's time for my top 10 books and top 10 short stories of 2021. So this top 10 list was a lot harder for me to make than I expected. It was really tough narrowing it down to 10. And I've read a lot of short stories this year, so I wanted to do a top 10 short stories in the same video. So we'll start with the top 10 books, move on to top 10 short stories. And this is really tough, and I felt bad taking some books off of the list, but I feel good about the list, but I still feel bad that I had to take books that I really loved off of the list. I won't be making a most disappointing list or books that let me down the most or whatever in 2021. I'm not throwing shade at anyone, it's just not my style. That's not what I like to do, and I've gotten enough hate mail this year for a certain series that I did not care for very much. So, faithful McFarlane fans, don't hit send all those emails. We aren't going to go there, but let's get into the list. So the first book on my list, we'll start at number 10, is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Now, those of you who have been around a while know that I'm not the biggest Stephen King fan. I don't dislike his writing. It's just not my not my cup of tea. It's just not for me. But I really loved 11/22/63. The time travel, the experience of going back in time, the way the whole system works, the way we played with history, and the way that I don't want to get too much into it. I don't want to spoil anything, but the way that things are supposed to happen a certain way, and when you start when you start throwing a wrench in how things were supposed to happen, there's consequences. So I really love that about the book. And I did start to see why people love Stephen King's character work, because the moments that used to feel like a drag, I started to really appreciate more. And I started to, those kind of side tangents we would get on in these books, I really enjoyed most of them. Number 9 on my list is Priest of Bones by Peter McLean. Now, this book was my first grimdark book. And going into it, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I had seen a review on Slowly Read's channel. This is before I even started my channel. It was a book I wanted to read that I was really excited about. And I kind of had to prepare myself because I kept hearing how dark grimdark was. So I was expecting like this extreme version of fantasy. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but I really love this book. It's a mix of like a gangster tale with fantasy, with trauma, with PTSD, with these broken people going back home after they've been at war, and the way the world changes without them. They're off fighting this war and they return home back to where they've wanted to go this whole time. And they return back and everything else, their home has changed. It's evolved since they've been gone. And they come back to discover their home isn't home anymore. It's a different place. It's moved on. It's evolved. It's changed for good and the bad. And the PTSD, the trauma that some of these characters experienced, and the way that the main character, he says, he mentions pulling levers for people. And it reminded me of just being in management and knowing how to motivate people, how to get them to see things in a different way. So I really appreciated all of that too. So it's a great grimdark book, and I will be finishing that series this year in 2022. That is my number 9 book. Number 8 on my list is Sleepwalking by Daniel Barnett. I started reading the Nightmareland Chronicles this year, just a few months ago, and reading each book, they kept getting better. And before Sleepwalking, I was thinking this series is really good. And after reading Sleepwalking, this series is something special. This is not just really good, it's special. There's something really special about this book, about the story, about the way Daniel Barnett writes. I mean, it just blew me away. Just how intense this book can be. There's really intense moments, there's quiet moments, there's a great mix of character work in here, of atmosphere. You feel like you're there. It's very immersive. You feel like you're there experiencing this, and you're terrified through a lot of it, and you're wondering what the hell is going on through a lot of it too. But that adds to the horror aspect of it too. Number 8 is Sleepwalking. Number 7 is Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This book is very guttural. That's the best way I can describe it. The writing style, the story, it really, really got under my skin. And some of the criteria for making this list for me this year was when I look back on this year, which books really had me thinking? Which books did I really enjoy? Then which books that just kept me thinking? It kept me thinking about them after, because some books, some movies, some music, you can really enjoy it while you're reading it, or while you're watching, or while you're listening, and then it's over and you kind of walk away and it's like, that was really good, but I'm moving on to the next thing now. And on this list, all these books kept me thinking, and Crossroads might have kept me thinking the longest after reading it. Number 6 on my list is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. This book changed my perspective on fantasy a little bit, because it turned all of these tropes and turned them on their heads, and it subverted expectations in a really clever way. I love the character work, and a lot of people say this book is just a bunch of characters. There's not a lot of plot, and I loved it. I love this book. The rest of the series I was hot or cold on, but The Blade Itself is up there with one of the most memorable reads for me of 2021. Number 5 on my list is Myths and Megaliths by Catherine McCarthy. This is a collection of quiet horror stories, and this book had me glued from cover to cover. Just every story was fantastic. They terrified me. It left me feeling empty. It left me wondering kind of looking in the mirror on myself, and it just ran the gamut of all these different emotions. And I'm a huge fan of quiet horror after this year, and I didn't even know what quiet horror was before this year. So I'm a huge fan of it. I'm a huge fan of Catherine McCarthy's writing style. So I can't say enough good things about Myths and Megaliths. It is just one of those books that are just another book that's really special, that kept me thinking long after I finished it. So number 4 on my list is Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan. This book I describe as just damn near perfect. It is just a great story and fantasy. One of the things that really bother me is when the character picks up a sword and they can just mow people down, and it's not a big deal, and these battles happen over and over and over, and you're never really worried about what happens because everyone's going to survive. The characters you didn't really get attached to, that doesn't give that time to develop. The characters don't have that time to really latch onto you, and it's kind of the same story repeating itself. That's one of my pet peeves for fantasy, and Bloodsong avoided all of those pitfalls for me anyway, in fantasy. The main character, the struggle that the main character goes through, when the character does accomplish things, you can feel that sense of accomplishment because you've gone through the struggles, you've gone through those low points, you've been along for the journey, and Anthony Ryan gives the characters time to develop, time for you to latch onto them, and these moments feel earned. When these moments do happen, they feel earned. You feel like you've been on this journey with them. You feel like you're with them side by side in all these different battles. And when the battles do happen, they're very visceral. You feel like you're there in the mud, in the dirt, with the iron clanging and with sword swinging and bodies on the floor. I mean, you feel like you're there. Again, you feel like you're there with these characters. You're there experiencing it together. And the villain in this book and in that series is just so great. And I don't want to say too much, but there was some moments in Bloodsong that it almost turned to a horror book for a little while, and I have a soft spot for that, as most of you know. So it was one of those books that are just really, really another book that stuck with me, that was just like blew me away how well written it was. Number 3 on my list is Beyond Redemption by Michael R. Fletcher. Now, I think I can speak for everyone who's read it and everyone who's tried to read it, is that this book is one of those books that, although I loved it, I understand it's not for everyone. It is very dark, it is very bleak, and all the characters are beyond redemption. There's no good characters. They're all bad people. All that bleakness and darkness is broken up with these character moments with these characters going back and forth and joking with each other, and kind of like this back and forth banter. So in a very big nutshell, insane people have these delusions that their delusions become reality, and there's different powers that they can possess, and there's a lot of different abilities and powers, and it gets very deep. And it wasn't deep in the sense where it's hard to keep track of, but it's deep in it's just it's so thought out and so different. So these delusions these insane people have become reality, and the world is set up to where it's almost like if a star gets too big, it collapses on itself. It's kind of like that, where not one person can become too powerful that they can just overwhelm everything. I mean, there's limits to their power, and that's what's so great about it, is that you can only become so powerful before you just kind of collapse on yourself. So this book, like I said, one of my favorites. It kept me thinking. It just was unlike anything I've read. Number 2 on my list is Nocturne, a collection of dark tales by HP Diaz. This is another book that I picked up on a whim after seeing it on Twitter. There was like a poster indie books here kind of thing throughout on Twitter one day, and I was just grabbing a bunch of books that looked interesting to me, and this is one of those books I picked up. And after it got sent to me, and I opened it and I had it on my shelf. One day I was looking for just something to read in between a couple of other books, and I grabbed this little thin book off the shelf, and I was just hooked on it. For those of you who aren't familiar with this collection, it's a collection of gothic horror stories. Each story is written in a different style, and it's not vastly different, but every story is a little different, and every story is great. I mean, there's really no low points in this book at all. And I used to really love short stories, and I just fell off and stopped reading them many years ago for just life or whatever got in the way. But this book rejuvenated my love of short stories. And number 1 on my list is Kings of Ash by Richard Nell. Now, again, those of you who have been around a while know that I love the Ash and Sand trilogy, and I am putting Kings of Ash as my number 1. But if I had to put all 3 books on the list, it would have taken a few slots on my top 10. I think all 3 books would have made my top 10, but I thought that was kind of, I couldn't narrow it down that much. So Kings of Ash was my favorite read of the year. It, again, another book that just, you expect certain things to happen because that's just the way things happen in fantasy or in this genre, and it is not what you expect. Things happen that you don't expect to happen. There's some risks taken here that you don't get very many places, and I love the main character. It is one of my all-time favorite characters, and I can go on and on about how much I love this book and this series. I do have a whole playlist with discussions for each book, so check that out if you want to hear more. I don't want to get too spoilery on it. I don't want to spoil the experience for anyone, but I have, again, videos about why you should read the series. It is just my favorite series of the year, of all time. Ash and Sand trilogy, go read it. So I also wanted to name off my favorite short stories of the year. So I made a list of 10, and this, again, was really tough to make because there's so many great short stories that I've read. So my top 10 is as follows. Number 10 is The Black Yacht by Brian Bowyer from Sinister Mix. My first dip into extreme horror, and it, it definitely was. And I was immediately a fan of Brian's writing after reading Sinister Mix. It's one of my favorite, one of my standouts of the year. It's, again, another book that I just loved from this year. The next one is Father, Son, Holy Rabbit by Stephen Graham Jones, and that's from his short story collection. I want to thank the Reading and Writing Life, Amanda, for recommending that story to me when I started Short Story September. That's a story that just, you think things are one way, and when you get to the end, it's not that way. So it is oh damn kind of end to that story. I won't spoil it for anyone, but it is an experience for sure. Number 8 on my list is The Undyne Lands by Michael R. Fletcher from a collection of obsessions. Another very dark and grim story, but I loved it. Number 7 is Craigan from Catherine McCarthy from Myths and Megaliths. Another story that just left me feeling gutted. That really helpless feeling of knowing that something's wrong with someone you really, really love, and there's nothing you can do to save them, nothing you can do to help them, and you just see this process take place in front of your eyes, and you can't help them, and that was really, really haunting. Number 6, I'll Come Back to You by Brian Keene from 25 Gates of Hell. It's a very short story. I think it's 2.5 or 3 pages long. It is very, very effective. It's a revenge story that it's a great idea for a revenge story. It's a quick read, but it is fantastic. Number 5, A New Kind of Drug by Mike Thorne from Darkest Hours. This is another story that Mike Thorne has a very, very uh, has a knack for writing characters, and he can develop characters in a short story. It just seems like it's seamless. And I'm a huge fan of Mike Thorne's writing, and I wasn't done with Peel Back and See before this video, but I think it would have been on my top 10 books list had I finished Peel Back and See. Number 4 on my list is Dark Ocean from Ferraro Smith from Of One Pure Will. This story and that collection, again, it's another book that's just special. It is very unique and very just, it's genius. I love that collection. It was very, very close to being on my top 10 list. But Dark Ocean especially is this, it feels like a nightmare when you're reading it. You get these bits and pieces, and it's very disorienting. And Of One Pure Will is a book you have to read when you're actively reading. So if you do pick that book up, you have to be actively reading. You have to be paying attention. It's worth your time if you are into short stories. Just a wonderful collection. Number 3 is The Life of Chuck by Stephen King from If It Bleeds. I wasn't a huge fan of If It Bleeds. This is the only story that I really loved from that collection. Obviously, it's on my list. But The Life of Chuck, and I have an admission to make that we did have a live discussion for If It Bleeds. And going into the discussion, I wasn't really sure what to think of this story. But it wasn't until after we started talking about it and discussing it that a light went off in my brain. The two synapses I have were firing at the same time. And it kind of, it's like, oh, that's what that story's about. It's kind of like, wow, that's genius. That's so great. And I thought it was just a great story. After we, I kind of heard some different perspectives on the story because I didn't get it at first. I admit it, I didn't get it at first, but once I did get it, it's like, wow, that's fantastic. That's such a great story. And I'm not sure if, side tangent, but I'm not sure if Stephen King writes short stories as much as he writes novellas. So a short story for Stephen King is more like a novella for most authors, but I digress. Number 2 on my list is The Melody of Mrs. Monroe by HP Diaz. That's from Nocturne, a collection of arc tales, previously mentioned. This is a great short story. It is just, again, another great story from that collection. Go read it if you haven't already. Now, my number one short story of 2021, the standout, I think it may be my favorite short story of all time, is When Betsy Whispers from Marianne Halbert. That's in Cold Comforts. This story, you start reading it and you're kind of like, what is going on with this? What is happening here? And once you start getting into the story, it blew me away. It's genius. It's just brilliant. I can't find enough ways to describe it. It's just so original, so inventive, so different, and just it's a great story. I'm afraid to say too much. I don't want to ruin it, but it's brilliant. I can't get enough of that story. I've read it a few times over, and I just never get tired of it. It's just such a great story. It may be my all-time favorite short story. It's awesome. So those are my top 10 books and top 10 short stories of 2021. It was like I said, it was really tough to narrow this down. So many books that I loved this year, so many books that I wanted to talk about, but I did think maybe I could do my top 20 or my top 15 or my top 12, and I'll stick to 10. And let me know down below what some of your favorite reads of 2021 were. What were books that really kept you thinking? What were books that you picked up on a whim or just by chance and you really loved them? Let me know all that down below. And of course, I thank you for watching, for taking the time to watch and comment, subscribe, like, all that fun stuff. You guys know the drill. I appreciate it. It lets me do this kind of thing, and the interaction is what keeps you coming back. If you want to get in touch with me, the best place is on our forum. I'll leave the link down below. We post about games, movies, books. We plan all of our bookish shenanigans there on our calendar, so check that out. If you haven't already, it's a small but tightly knit community, so we'd love to have you if that's of interest to you. I can also be found on Vero. I use Vero. I'm one of the 5 people who use Vero. It's a really great platform, but no one really uses it. I still enjoy it. I don't know. And also, I can be found on Twitter. I have a bookish Twitter that I keep mostly for books. All my personal stuff goes on Vero, but on Twitter, I try and keep it book focused, and I'm trying to use Twitter less and less. So you can also find me there if you use Twitter. So again, thanks for watching. I hope you had a great 2021 and an even better 2022. We'll talk to you soon.